Very much, Mark, and good Sabbath. Happy feast to everyone. It is a bright and sunny day, and people are smiling, and that's what I like to see. Makes me smile too. You know, the Feast of Tabernacles, as I had mentioned last night in the opening message, is probably one of the most favored of holy days among God's people, at least in our age and around the world. It's one of the few annual observances that it provides an opportunity for all of us to travel, to come together and see old friends, to make new friends, and experience many activities and have conversations that are inspiring and nourishing to one another. And all of us have traveled some distance to get here, whether it's a few hundred or a few thousand miles, as Mark did, to share the feast in this location. And of course, this is one of the aspects of the fall pilgrimage feast that remains intact. That is, traveling to a location where God has symbolically placed his name, and I think also literally. And so 3 times a year, Israel was commanded to congregate in the place where God had chosen. And the people at that time were fairly centrally located, that is, in the Middle East in the land of Canaan, and they lived in an area that was roughly 200 or more square miles. And pilgrims would travel anywhere from, a short distance to up to maybe 100 miles or more to come to the area where God had commanded them to hold these 3 pilgrimage celebrations. But today, God's people live all around the globe in various locations in different nations around the world. And our method of travel, of course, is very different than those of old. In ancient times, they would have used perhaps donkeys, if you were well enough to have one of those, camels maybe, depending on the location. Much of the time, I think they traveled on feet, and they would have sometimes animals that would pull carts for them. But today, we use planes, trains, and automobiles, and we are able to travel vast distances in a relatively short period of time. I mean, do you remember how long it took for you to get from Australia to America? Isn't it something about 15 hours or something like that? And I don't know how many thousands of miles, but relatively speaking, that's not very long compared to the distances that you travel, probably halfway or more around the world. And so the churches of God today is unlike ancient Israel, who were actually centrally located, and our feasts are observed in a similar way, but there are some notable differences in the way we keep the Feast of Tabernacles today. And beside the fact that you and I travel much longer distances than they did at that time, using mechanized horseless carriages, as some would call it, one major difference between our observance and that of Israel, or ancient Israel, is that they were told to dwell in booths for 7 days. And so what is a booth? What purpose did it serve? What did it represent? And does it still serve a purpose today? Are we, being spiritual Israelites, if you will, Israelites from the heart, what God intended an Israelite to be, are we required to dwell in tents or booths at the Feast of Tabernacles? And let's go over to Deuteronomy 12, and we'll begin talking about some of these questions today. Because a booth, as defined in the commandment, it's more of like a cottage or a hut, and or some kind of covert. Not enduring, that is, not something that would last for very long. And the Hebrew word for booths is the word sukkah. And in the Feast of Tabernacles, declared in Leviticus 23, I know we're going to read about it here in Deuteronomy 12, but in Leviticus 23, it is literally the chag of sukkahs, which sounds kind of foreign in our tongue, but that's how it was pronounced in the Hebrew. And so seeing that booths or sukkahs are the theme of these holy days, how do they fit into the modern observance of the Feast of Tabernacles? The representation of the annual holy days remains intact. It has not changed. And so none of us are spending the week in a tent or in a hut, even though some of our facilities are call it cottages. It's not the cottage that was in a booth, like the booths that were erected in Israel. And so could it be that we might be missing something about these days because we do not dwell in a hut or a tent? Well, to begin, even though we are not dwelling in booths or tents, most of us, I think, understand more about the Feast of Tabernacles and what these days represent than most of ancient Israel ever knew. They went through the motions, but they did not understand exactly what these days pictured. And even when Christ returned, they expected him to bring his kingdom at that time, that he was going to establish Israel permanently on the earth at that time as a nation to serve the rest of the people around the world. And so even though we are not living in sukkahs, we do observe God's feasts, and we observe them in a spirit that is similar to that of ancient Israel. And so the walls of our dwellings, they are made of wood and plaster or drywall. Perhaps there's concrete or stone or bricks involved. Roofs that we have, our roofs are shingled, and they are not made of palm leaves. But this does not violate, actually, God's command, because what may be the most significant difference when it comes to booths is the fact that we have no temple in Jerusalem, that we are commanded to travel, but we have no centrally placed or centrally located place of worship today. And what many do not understand is that the command to keep the pilgrimage feasts instructed God's people to go to the place where he had chosen to place his name. And so let's begin looking at this at Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5, where it says that you shall seek the place where the eternal your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go. And there you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. And you shall eat before the eternal your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, and your households in which you, the eternal your God, has blessed you. And this is a reference directly to the Feast of Tabernacles, as we'll read further in just a few moments. But these verses, they speak of a location where God chose to put his name for his dwelling place. And so the people were told to travel to this location 3 times a year. And the chosen site was where the tabernacle stood. And this, of course, was later where the temple was built under the direction of Solomon. And this was the area where God had chosen to place the Ark of the Covenant, which was a type of his tabernacle or a dwelling place for him on the earth. And this was a central location of worship services for the nation of Israel. And every holy day requires a holy convocation, whether it's the Feast of Trumpets or the Day of Atonement. All of them require a holy convocation. But God told Israel to keep 3 particular pilgrimage feasts by appearing before the eternal your God. And though everyone was invited, we understand that during these 3 pilgrimage feasts, there were at least a minimum of a male representative from each family or household that was required to come up to where the Ark of the Covenant was located. Let's go over to Exodus 25 for a moment to look at this a little deeper, because Moses was given specific instructions about building a tabernacle in the wilderness. And this included, of course, the courtyard and the holy place. And these were all symbolic of many things. Even the furniture within the holy place was symbolized things that were in heaven, and they represented God's his relationship with his people on the earth. But the focal point of this place, this tabernacle, was the fact that it represented God's dwelling, or a type of God's dwelling through his Spirit among the people. And God said in Exodus 25, and in verse 8, to let them make a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show you. That is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it. So the court of the tabernacle, the holy place, and the place of meeting is what God commanded for Israel to produce, to assemble. He gave specific instructions about this tabernacle. Everything that was built within and without, was specified by him. The furniture, even down to every little knob that was used to fasten the curtains and to set up the walls. Everything was built according to his specifications. And so God was with the people symbolically and also literally at times through this structure of the tabernacle. And the pinnacle of this tabernacle was the holiest place of all, sometimes called the Holy of Holies. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. And this area and the Ark of it was designed to portray God's throne, a place for him to be among the people. In verses 10 and continuing, talking about this ark, and they shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width, 1.5 cubits its height, which is roughly 45 inches by 27 by 27 inches. And you shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and out. You shall overlay it, and you shall make on it molding of gold all around. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put it in its 4 corners, 2 rings on one side, and 2 rings on the other side, and poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. And this, of course, was for the carrying of the ark, because nobody was to touch this throne, or a type of God's throne on the earth. And you shall put, in verse 16, into the ark the testimony which I shall give you, which is referring to the commandments, the tablets. And you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width, which is the same length and width on both sides. And notice that it's called a mercy seat. Why call this a mercy seat if it did not represent God's throne? Because it did. God sits on a throne of judgment and showing mercy. His mercy endures. And you shall make in verse 18, you shall make 2 cherubims of gold of hammered work, and you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherubim at one end, and the other cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of its one place with the mercy seat. And these shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. And so these cherubims pictured angelic beings that sit at the very throne of God. And then you shall put this mercy seat on top of the ark, in verse 21, and the ark of the testimony within. And then he says in verse 22, and there I will meet with you. I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give in commandment to the children of Israel. And so the location of the Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle, the courtyard of the tabernacle, and the holy place and the holiest of all. And this tabernacle wandered around in the wilderness of sin for 40 years. After the conquests of Canaan, the Ark of the Covenant stayed within the tabernacle and in the area of Shiloh for many years. After that, it went to a place called Nob, and then to a place called Gideon. Finally, the Ark of the Covenant was taken to Jerusalem under the leadership of King David. And then we understand later God inspired Solomon to build a magnificent temple that would be God's place among the people. And then even after that first temple was destroyed, though, and the ark was hidden, the temple in Jerusalem continued to be a place where God had chosen to place his name. And he even rebuked the people during Nehemiah's time, saying when they were supposed to rebuild the temple at that time, he's saying, hey, everybody is going to your own house, doing your own thing, making sure your houses are secure, but my house, it lays in ruins. Why aren't you working on my house? A home that a place where I should dwell among the people. And back to Deuteronomy 12, the main point of discussing this first part of this sermon is that the tabernacle and the temple are the location that God spoke of when he gave the command for the people of Israel to travel and to dwell in booths during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so important was this annual observance that God's people were instructed to keep a festival tithe and to use these funds to travel where this place was and to come before him and to rejoice during this time. And so speaking of the festival tithe in Deuteronomy 12, and verse 17, He said, "You may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, of your new wine, or your oil, the firstborn of your herd or flock, or of any of the offerings which you vow of your free will offerings, or of the heave offerings of your hand. But you must eat them before the eternal your God in the place which the eternal your God chooses. You and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite who is within your gates. And you shall rejoice before the eternal your God in all to which you put your hands to do. And take heed to yourself that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live in your land." And so the festival tithe was used as a means to celebrate where God had chosen to place his name. And so the whole family, as I had stated, was invited to come to this important event, as the scriptures tell us plainly right there. And it also says to not forsake the Levite during this observance. In other words, local priests that lived among the people throughout the land of Canaan, they would need to go up and keep these feasts as well. And so they were to be taken with the people, where they would rejoice before God 3 times a year. 2 chapters over to chapter 14, speaking again of the pilgrimage feasts here, and in verse 22, it says that you shall truly tithe of all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year, and you shall eat before the eternal your God. Verse 22. And now in verse 23, you shall eat before the eternal your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. The tithe of your grain, of your new wine, your oil, the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the eternal your God always. And so it's talking about those things that you profit from, your profit margin, if you will. Those things which you dedicate to use in worship and under his commandment. And so God didn't leave it up to the common people to decide where the location of his worship would be at this time. No, God chose his dwelling place to be in Jerusalem. And he inspired certain individuals to set up the tabernacle. Well, we see it was in Shiloh, and then it moved to a few other areas. But eventually it was in Jerusalem, and a temple was built there. And so Jerusalem continued to be the central place of worship where God had chosen to place his name for centuries. And therefore, the command to keep the Feast of Tabernacles and to dwell in booths at that time, it literally meant for people to travel to Jerusalem and to celebrate in this location where the temple stood. And so one of the reasons I had decided to make this point clear today is because we've had some question this today. And we don't have a continual central place of location where God chooses to place his name for feast observances. There is no temple in Jerusalem. There is no Levitical priesthood. We don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's hidden to this very day, and therefore there is no explicit location of worship where God chooses to place his name. But the command is still applicable. It still applies to each of us today. And so today we are told that we need to worship God in spirit and in truth. And there has been a change in the ministry, as pointed out by the author of Hebrews, when that book was widely written because of the understanding that the Levitical priesthood would be disbanded, if you will, and that the temple would be destroyed. But those things that applied still apply, but in a different form, a different aspect, if you will, a spiritual aspect today, where there are ministers, even in the Church of God today, that serve in priestly functions, as did the Levites at that time. And so God's Spirit dwells within certain individuals who are called, and then therefore his name is placed in those locations where their faithful organizations have ordained ministers that have chosen areas of worship for the holy days that are considered pilgrimage feasts. And so elders and ministers and pastors and what have you, they have been given the authority to choose a location, to do the research, to counsel, to pray about it, fast about it even, if necessary, and to choose these locations where members can gather and observe God's holy days. And so on a spiritual level, the Feast of Tabernacles sites that have been selected today by ordained ministers, they are locations where God has chosen to place his name. They are locations where there is worship, true worship of God in spirit and in truth. And this is understood by many of us today. I understand. Most of us, this isn't really anything new to most of us. But in our age, it seems like everything that we once understood is being questioned today. People are questioning everything that the church once knew this was right and good. And in some respects, this can have a positive outcome in that people can go back and reprove things and understand, oh, yeah, we were right. On the other hand, there are people that are trying to find ways to get around keeping the law the way we should. And so we do need to go back and re-examine some of these things and prove it to ourselves, of course, and don't take my word for it. Go back and read the scriptures and prove it to yourself. And part of the reason this is brought up is because there are even some who have chosen to become independent from the Church of God as a whole, and they will choose their own locations of pilgrimage feasts and go wherever they want. You know, get together with a group of believers and say, well, we're going to go over to such and such a place and keep the feast over there because that's where we want to go. We don't want to go where the ministers chose to go. And now, whether or not God places his name within some of these people that go off on their own is debatable, of course. But we would call, I think, and I would call such behavior presumptuous. And I don't think it's what God intended, for every man to do what's right in his own eyes. And even among the official locations of observance, there are some things that are different between our observance and the observances of old. And instead of course, the one that I pointed out, instead of everybody swelling into a central location in the Middle East, people congregate in various locations all around the world. But these are accepted methods of observance today. And because traveling is involved, and of course we understand there are these 3 required offerings annually, there is a need, of course, for a separate festival tithe to be kept for this purpose, as we had just read in Deuteronomy 12 and verse 14. And people refer to this as a second tithe. It's kept separate from the first tithe, the ministerial tithe. And these funds are used for travel expenses. They are used for meals. They are used for extracurricular activities, lodging or what have you, and even offerings. And well-known instructions regarding this tithe is Deuteronomy 14 and verse 24. It says, but if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Eternal your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Eternal your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money, and take the money in your hand, and you shall go to the place where the Eternal your God chooses. And you shall spend that money in whatever your heart desires, for ox, for sheep, for wine, or similar drink. In other words, it's talking about a large barbecue here, and with some drinks involved. And you shall eat there before the Eternal your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. And you shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. And so most of us understand the use of the second tithe during the Feast of Tabernacles, and the offering portion that is mentioned here and was also mentioned in the sermonette. It falls into play with verse 27, where it tells people to not forsake the Levite because he has no inheritance with you. And during these times, you know, it's a reminder, I think, to the individuals at that time that the local ministry should not be left behind. See, the tribe of Levi was not given an inheritance in the land. They didn't really have a profit margin among the people. And so the Levites were primarily responsible for the needs of the people religiously. And today we see that the ministers in the church serve that function in ministering, and whether a pastoral position or an elder type positions and what have you. And so these individuals in ancient times, they had no inheritance. They were supported by the individuals in the land through tithes and through offerings. And so they would need to be taken along with the people to celebrate with everyone else. And because it says they were not to be forgotten and that they were to be provided for, it seems that there was no need for these individuals to keep a separate festival tithe as everybody else did. Instead, it says that they were brought with the people along to the place where he had chosen to place his name. And so there are elements we see in the Feast of Tabernacles observance today that have not changed, while some has changed. And over to Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 now. We won't get through this feast without reading this scripture. Another similarity between ancient celebrations and ours today is found in the instruction to dwell in booths. And some are thinking, well, our dwellings this week, they're nothing like a sukkah. I mean, we have strong, sturdy walls. We don't have palm branches on our roofs. And this is true. We aren't staying in huts or tents. But what some may not realize is that the booths were unique to the people of Israel in the Promised Land. And notice the instructions here in verse 33 of Leviticus 23. Then the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets. Oh, excuse me, that's 23, huh? Verse 33. Then the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles, and for 7 days to the Eternal. And on the 1st day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. And for 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Eternal. And on the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Eternal. It's a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. And these are the feasts of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire to the Eternal, a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, and everything on its day. And it's talking about the duties of the Levites here at this time, beside the Sabbaths of the Eternal, beside your gift, beside your vows, and beside your free will offerings, which you shall give to the Eternal. And then also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Eternal for 7 days. On the 1st day shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. And you shall take for yourselves on the 1st day fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Eternal your God for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to the Eternal for 7 days in the year. And it shall be a statute forever in your generations, and you shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Eternal your God. And so we see this command given to the nation of Israel, and we see that it does apply. It has a strong application to the faithful unto this day. And there's a spiritual application, of course, to it that's applicable to us. But the instructions that are given for people to travel to God's temple and the directive to dwell in sukkahs or booths is not applicable to us. You see, it says, all who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths in verse 42. Now, some of your translations might render it all who are Israelite born. But the meaning is really the same. And in other words, God is making this a requirement of those individuals who are a part and lived in the nation of Israel. Now, if somebody was not native to the land, if they were not of one of the tribes, these individuals were not required to dwell in booths. And so Gentiles that lived in and around this area in the Middle East, they were not required. There wouldn't be nothing wrong with them doing it, but it wasn't a requirement of those people. But today we see that there is neither Jew nor Gentile. As Paul said, there is neither male nor female when it comes to applying God's law. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We all worship God in the same methods. And therefore the requirement to dwell in literal booths during the Feast of Tabernacles, it is not something that we are required to do today. There is no nation under God in the Middle East, even though some claim to be a nation under God. There is no temple, there is no Ark of the Covenant, and Jerusalem is not the holy city at this time. And so it's my belief, I think, that God added these conditions to dwelling in booths because he knew that there would be a time where there would be no temple in Jerusalem, that his name would not stand in this place. There would be no unique location of God's name. And so those called to worship God would need to do so in spirit and truth, wherever they were on the entire planet. And so I think God made this a condition of that nation, but not of those who would become, or a type of spiritual Israelite, because you and I are not required to travel to Jerusalem. There's no temple there. God's name is not in that place at this time. And so you and I are not required to go out and gather palm branches or, shrubbery or what have you. We're not required to set up a tent in order to keep the feast for 7 days. Now, there wouldn't be anything wrong with doing that, but it is not something that you and I have to do. And so this is, I think, one of the differences in the method of observance we keep today as opposed to the method that was kept by ancient Israel. But the symbolism of the booth this remains the same. And so God told Israel that the reason they were to dwell in booths was so that, in verse 43, he said that so your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. But the booths that the children of Israel lived in when they came out of the land of Egypt, hundreds of thousand people, these were not made of palm leaves and shrubs. These were widely tents. They were made, of some type of material, canvas, or more than likely, most of them were made of animal skins. But they served the same purpose as a booth. The symbolism remains the same as found in the required sukkah. And so Israel's exodus from Egypt toward the promised land, it was symbolic of converts coming out of a life of sin. We are aware of the symbolism, coming out of a nation or a place of sin and heading toward a promised land, heading toward the promised kingdom of God is what that represents. And so the exiting nation of Israel, they lived in temporary structures while they journeyed through the wilderness of sin for 40 years. And this represents our temporary existence while wandering in what is, a spiritual wilderness of sin today, heading toward the promised kingdom of God. And so the booths outside of Egypt, they were not a permanent residence for the people. They sought another land. They looked toward another land that would be a permanent residence for that nation. It would be the land of Canaan. And all of our homes today, and the places that we stay in while we are celebrating the feast today, these, they might be made of stronger materials, whether it's wood or brick or stone or drywall. They might have plumbing and electricity. But these buildings are not our permanent homes. Even those ones that we live in back, where we dwell for on a more permanent basis, these are not our permanent residences either. We seek another place, another home, another land of promise. And so the people of Israel, they followed God in a pillar of fire cloud, and God led them all the way to the land of Canaan eventually. And we follow God, who is our pillar, who is our support, showing us the way to the kingdom of God. Genesis 33. And so we see that a booth, it is symbolic of a temporary existence, a temporary structure, and this kind of tabernacle, it can come in many shapes and forms. It might be a tent, it could be a hut, could be a cottage, or it can even be a stable. And one example of this is in Genesis 33. And here we have Jacob journeying to Succoth. And in verse 17, Genesis 33, verse 17, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and he built himself a house. And the word for house here is the Hebrew bayith, which is something that's made for a family. It's more resistant to the elements and more comfortable for people to live in. And then it says that he made booths for his livestock, and this is the word sukkah, which it was made for animals. It was a lower standard of a protective covering, and some of these may have had roofs or not, and to protect from rain or snow. But others may have been more like a corral or a pen or a stable, if you will. Then these were designed, of course, to keep the animals in a central location. If not broken down, if left standing on its own, these structures would eventually just, begin to fall into disarray and to break and fall apart and decay. We've all been on journeys where we see barns kind of leaning to one side and roofs crushed in, or fences that are kind of falling apart and just seem to be like melting back into the soil. And they're not durable. The homes built for people, of course, are a higher quality than this. They will last much longer. They're more durable, but they still are not permanent. Nothing physical in this life will stand forever. And so the portrayal, I think, is not limited to sukkahs. It's not limited to cabins or cottages or even our suburban homes. God even made mankind, each of us, with a protective covering, didn't he? Called skin. There are various layers of skin that protect us from the elements, from disease, or from frostbite, is to the best, without clothing. But the point is, these are a type of tabernacle even for us that we live within, the spirit of man dwells in. And even the earth itself, this was designed with a protective firmament, which helps the earth to endure or last much longer than any human being would, but it too has a finite existence, because given enough time, everything physical in this life would flatline. Without God's word supporting the elements, everything would quickly fall into disarray and would decompose and just come to be lifeless. And so the theme of the Feast of Tabernacles is that you and I, we live in a physical existence, and we have booths to portray this very thing. We have homes and even our bodies to portray the fact that everything in this world is temporary. And by observing these days, we acknowledge the fact that we are looking, hoping to achieve something that is not temporary, but something that will, in fact, last forever. And we are going to hear more about that particular part of this observance on the 8th day. Nehemiah 8. Sukkahs are also mentioned in the book of Nehemiah, and this, of course, is talking about the period of time after Judah's return from captivity. They were, of course, 70 years in exile, as we know, and many of the individuals had learned the lessons from this experience of being kicked out of the Promised Land, out of Jerusalem, and they had returned to Jerusalem, but not all was understood about what was required of them. Not all was understood about God's laws and statutes and judgments when they returned. They did lose quite a bit while they were in captivity, and it wasn't until their return from exile that the law was studied in depth and more was understood. In Nehemiah 8 and in verse 1, it says that all the people gathered together here to hear Ezra reading the law. All the people gathered together as one man, or with one mind is what it means, in the open square that was in front of the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Eternal had commanded Israel. And so Ezra, the priest, he brought the law before the assembly of men and women and all who could hear with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. And this would have been the memorial of trumpets. And then he read from this book of the law in the open square that was in front of the water gate from morning until midday, before the men and women and those who could understand. And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. And so Ezra the scribe stood on a platform of wood which they had made for the purpose, and beside him at his right hand stood these other individuals here. And I don't need to go through all the names. Let's go to verse 5. Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, and he was standing above all the people, and when he opened it, all the people stood up. Ezra blessed the Eternal, the great God, and then all the people answered, Amen, Amen, while lifting up their hands, and they bowed their heads and worshipped the Eternal with their faces to the ground. In verse 8, so they read distinctly from the book in the law of God, and they gave the sense and helped them to understand the reading. In other words, this is like expounded readings, is what they are talking about. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, this day is holy to the eternal God. Do not mourn nor weep, for all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. And so this is referring to a holy day, the Feast of Trumpets. And then he said to them, go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to the eternal. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the eternal is your strength. And so the Levites quieted all the people, saying, be still, for the day is holy, and do not be grieved. And all the people went their way to eat and drink, and they sent portions and rejoiced greatly because they understood the words that were declared to them. So it's almost like you see a sense of sorrow, grieving that, they were now hearing the words of the law read and understanding, oh, we haven't been doing all of this. They were repenting, I think, at this time. Sorry for not really keeping the law the way God required of his people. So they began to read the law here in the first day of the 7th month. And whether or not this was a 7th year Sabbath, where the law was to be read during a sabbatical year, is not known. And if it was a 7th year, the reading of the laws we see under the instructions of Moses in Deuteronomy 31, this was to begin in the Feast of Tabernacles, not during the Memorial of Trumpets. And the Feast of Tabernacles is the 15th day of the 7th month, not the 1st. In any case, it was a holy day to these individuals. In verse 13, and it's a holy day to us today. So on the 2nd day now, the heads of the fathers, the houses, and all the people with the priests and the Levites were gathered to Ezra, the scribe, in order to understand the words of the law. And they found written in the law, which the Eternal had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month. And it's talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. And that they should announce and proclaim all their cities in Jerusalem, saying, go out to the mountain and bring olive branches, branches of oil trees, myrtle branches, palm branches, and branches of leafy trees to make booths as it is written. And then all the people went out, and they brought them and made themselves booths, each one on the roof of his house, or in the courtyard, or in the courts of his house, the house of God, and in the open square of the water gate, and in the open square of the gate of Ephraim. And the whole assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths, and they sat under the booths. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun until that day, the children of Israel had not done so. And there was a very great gladness. And also day by day, from the first day until the last day, Ezra read from the book of the law of God, and they kept the feast 7 days. And on the 8th day there was a sacred assembly according to the prescribed manner. So it seems that the 2nd day of the month, the 2nd day of the 7th month, that is, they announced that the readings that, they kind of rediscovered this. So booths are to be made. We're to go out and keep the Feast of Tabernacles in this way. Now there's no mention, of course, of the 10th day, which is the observance of the Day of Atonement. And I think it goes without saying that they kept this observance as well, reading from the law, but it's not written in this account here. But booths were erected at that time, and they were placed anywhere that they could, whether it was up against a wall or in the court or on the roof or anywhere that they could build a booth or a sukkah. They were set up, and they kept the Feast of Tabernacles at that time. And we see that this tradition is still kept even to this day. Of course, there were breaks in that type of observance, but many of the Jews in Jerusalem today will set up booths all around the city, wherever they can, on the side of a building, on a roof, in a courtyard, wherever they can. And if anybody has been to that area or seen some of the narrow streets, it's going to be quite claustrophobic. I mean, the streets are already very crowded as it is, and you add all these booths into the mix, and it gets a little crazy. But the people who celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles during Ezra's time, they did the best they could. And I think those in Jerusalem today, they do what they feel is best with the understanding that they have. But what many do not understand is that booths made of palm trees or foliage or olive trees or oil trees or myrtle branches, as it says here, it's not required of God's people at this time. And again, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with doing that, but it is not something that we have to do because we are not Israelite born. We don't live in the nation of Israel. We don't have a nation under God's law. We don't have a temple and what have you. We've been through all that already. Galatians 3. Galatians in chapter 3. So the instructions were given to pilgrims coming out of Egypt into a promised land. And yet, even the land of Canaan was not destined to be a permanent residence for God's people. Jerusalem, a name meaning a place of peace, has rarely seen peace down through the ages. It has been a place of conflict and war even before it was taken over by the people of Israel. The holy city, as it's called by some today, is not holy. God does not place his name there, and it's truly, I think it's rarely been holy, maybe short periods of time under the direction of Solomon and maybe some of David, and also during the time of the rebuilding of the second temple for a period of time. But the holy city today, or the city that is supposed to be holy today, will be holy at one time. Christ will return, a temple will be established in that area, and I believe that people will be required to come to this place and live in booths during the Feast of Tabernacles once again. But we see that even Jerusalem at that point, Jerusalem today and Jerusalem at that point during the millennium, it's only a type. It represents something else, a better place, a higher place, Jerusalem above. And so the people that came out of Egypt, they were called, God desired for them to be a nation of priests. And they were to be a nation of priests in a promised land, representing the kingdom of heaven, where God is calling individuals to become kings and priests of his government. And these are things that we are to remember during these days, and of course, every day, that you and I, we are strangers, we are pilgrims in this world, and everything in it to us can be symbolic of a sukkah, something that is not going to last. And we seek a new kingdom, a new world, a new place, even Jerusalem above, that will endure forever. And so after the establishment of the New Testament church and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the church Christ built became an extension of God's people found in the children of Israel. And Paul wrote that they are not all Israel who are of Israel. In other words, not everybody born of Israel was truly considered an Israelite indeed. That is according to God's definition of what an Israelite should be. And those people, there are many people, Gentiles, that were not born of Israel who are considered an Israelite indeed, that live according to the law, according to God's commandments. And so an Israelite, indeed, are those individuals who strive to have no guile and who are faithful to God. And Paul wrote in Galatians 3, and in verse 28, he said that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, and you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And so we see how eras of the Old Covenant church, they came to reflect eras of the New Testament church, as stated in great detail in our book, Evidence for Eras. And the Levitical priesthood even is reflected in apostles and elders and pastors and other ordained ministers in the church. And so God still requires his people to keep the commandments. He still requires his people to keep the holy days and to tithe and to not eat unclean meats. And so we continue to keep God's commandments and his holy days in spirit and in truth today. And so our manner of observance it really serves the same purpose, even though you and I don't live in a literal sukkah for 7 days. And so attendees that come to keep the Feast of Tabernacles all around the world, we live in rooms, cottages, cabins, what have you, that are not permanent to us. And they all have the modern most of them anyway, have modern conveniences of home with plumbing and electricity. But even so, they serve the same purpose as long as we keep this in mind. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. It should be a focal point of these days. Do not lose focus about what the Feast of Tabernacles represents, that all of this is going to be done away with. And we look for something else. Our focus is to be another place, a new world, and a new kingdom. Ecclesiastes 3 as I had stated earlier, in many ways, I think we have a better understanding of what the booths represented and what the holy days represent than most of ancient Israel ever had. And no matter what place we might live in, and no matter where we are, none of this is going to endure. None of this is going to last forever in this age. And so the Feast of Tabernacles, it only lasts 7 days, and then we have an 8th day. And so it is with the physical existence, that the physical existence has a limited amount of time. And humanity on this earth has been given a limited amount of time, a limited number of millenniums in order to exist. And this truth is represented during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we can't try to hang on to all of these things. I know they're comfortable. They become so important to us, our homes or our cars or our jobs or our lives. There's a certain sense of duty and responsibility involved, but it is not to be our focal point, a driving motivator for us in life. We are to seek something else, a new place. There was an individual by the name of Fred Smith who was a professing Christian who became very ill, and he needed to stay on dialysis in order to survive. But even on dialysis, things seemed to be getting worse, and he fell into a state of semi-consciousness and kind of faded in and out for a number of days. Every once in a while, he would kind of come to and he'd blurt out some words saying, "I want to go home." And then he would kind of fade out, and then he'd come in and fade in again, "I want to go home." And this was very heart-wrenching for the family who had to watch him go through all of this. And after a period of about 36 hours, the family had gotten together to talk about what should we do. He just seems to be suffering and suffering. I mean, what do we do with our beloved father, Fred? And after a very heartfelt and very troubling conversation, they decided, well, he's telling us he wants to go somewhere else. He wants to be with Christ. He doesn't want to endure this pain and suffering anymore. So he was telling them, I want to go home to heaven, so to speak. And so they decided they were going to take him off of dialysis. And so they did, and then a number of hours went by, and he started to get worse. He started to have heart trouble, and he started gasping for air, and this was troubling to watch. But then he came to for a second, and they said, "Dad, it's okay. We understood what you meant, that you want to go home, that you want to go to heaven." He's like, "No, I want to go to Parkchester Drive, my home. That's where I want to go." And they're like, "Whoa, wow." So they put the dialysis machine back on and kind of nursed him back to health so he could go back to his home. But you see what I mean? Even on our deathbed, sometimes it's hard to let go of the things of this world. We're physical. We become very attached to them. We feel like we need them. They're our comfort zones. There are things that make us feel better physically. But we have to learn that these things are temporary. That isn't what to drive us. That isn't what we truly live for. We live for God. We live for Christ, seeking a home that is from above. So the truth, or this truth, is represented even in our bodies, as shown by Fred Smith. They will break down. We will, eventually die of old age if we live long enough. But our bodies were designed for a purpose, even much like the booth that was designed for a purpose, so that we can understand that this isn't going to last. These bodies are simply a tabernacle for something to dwell within at this time. We are given the spirit of man, a spirit that is yours, unique to you and me, that it contains all of our memories and all of our character. And this spirit was given to this physical flesh and blood, and we live within these bodies. And we're, if we are called, and God gives us His Holy Spirit. It's a type of temple or tabernacle, if you will, for God's Spirit. And so Paul wrote, "What man knows the things of a man except the spirit of man which is in him?" And so we see that this indicates that there is this spirit given to us. It's whether this is upon conception, some believe it's upon birth, but regardless, it is a spirit that is given to every human being. And the preacher wrote this in Ecclesiastes and in chapter 3 and verse 21. He wrote that who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward? And what he is talking about is death. When the body dies, when this tabernacle or booth that you and I live in of our flesh and bone, when it dies, the spirit goes upward. And in chapter 12, he mentions this again. In verse 7, he said, "Then the dust will return to the earth," speaking of our flesh. "The dust will return to the earth as it was," because we are made of dust, "and the spirit will return to God who gave it." And so the Spirit, it has a record of our life's experiences. It records everything that you and I have done. Even if we don't all have access to everything that we have experienced in life, we can't remember it all, it is all in there. It's like a videotape, something that stores our memories and even our character. And we understand this process that, that is the one thing we will take with us. Nobody in this life who dies with the most toys wins. Most toys mean nothing. It's just all going to fade. But our character, whoever dies with godly character, they win. They win the prize. They receive the crown of life. And so when Christ returns, those who have obtained a good testimony through faith will be awakened in a first resurrection. And whether or not you and I will be included in that first resurrection depends on what we do in this tabernacle of flesh. Even our bodies represent the Feast of Tabernacles in a way. Pictures something greater, more perfect, a more perfect tabernacle that will be given at one time, not made with human hands, but designed by God Himself, who will reward everyone according to their works, whether good or bad. And this is an enduring truth that most of Israel never understood. But we understand it. Or at least I hope we do. And we should really use this to our advantage, this understanding that we have. Isaiah 33. The millennial temple that Christ will have built in the Middle East is going to be glorious. It is going to be magnificent, but yet humble, and it's going to serve divine purposes. But it's going to be another physical tabernacle. Still, it's going to be a place for God to dwell on the earth, a type of Christ's throne here on the earth. And so we had the earthly tabernacle that was designed where God placed the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon was commissioned to build a temple for that ark. We had the second temple, and even though the ark was lost or hidden at that time, God still called that second temple His house, as He told the people of Judah at that time. And in the not too distant future, there's going to be a third temple built. But that third temple is not going to be a tabernacle for God's Spirit. But during the millennium, there will be a grand temple that will be established. And it's described in the last several chapters of the book of Ezekiel. And this is going to be a place where God again will place His name in what will truly be or become a holy city at that time. It's going to serve a purpose. It is going to serve as a type of an earthly throne for Christ at that time. And it's going to last for more than 1,000 years. But again, it's still going to be transitory. It's still physical. It will still not last. The millennial temple, as wonderful as it will be, it still represents something else, something far superior. It portrays Jerusalem above, the holy city that exists right now in the kingdom of heaven. And this temple sits on heavenly Mount Zion. The prophet Isaiah had the hope of this spiritual city where God's throne is at this time. And he wrote this in Isaiah 33 and in verse 20. He said, "Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feasts. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet home, a tabernacle that will not be taken down. There is no destroying the Jerusalem above. Not one of its stakes will ever be removed, nor will any of its cords be broken. But there the majestic eternal will be for us a place of broad rivers and streams in which no galley with oars will sail, nor majestic ships pass by. For the eternal is our judge, the eternal is our lawgiver, the eternal is our king, and he will save us." And this is an enormous hope that will be expounded on the 8th day. But Isaiah was speaking of the new Jerusalem above. This is the true city of everlasting peace. And Christ said he went to prepare a place for you. And it is our understanding that he is going to prepare offices, and he is doing it right now for those who will be chosen in the Jerusalem above. And this city will eventually come down from heaven to a new earth after Christ's millennial reign with the chosen saints. And so the Feast of Tabernacles, it represents all of these temporary things, if you think about it, whether it's a booth, a cabin, a tent, our bodies, and even the earth. As nice as they might be, as comfortable as we might feel in them from time to time, they are not going to last. As beautiful as this world is, even, and the towering mountains that you talked about, Mark, in your remarks today, as beautiful as the lakes and streams and the rivers are, and the trees and the noble steeds and many of the majestic animals, and all of these things, they represent something else. They represent another place, another time, another age that will last forever. But they still serve a purpose. They serve a divine purpose of letting us know that, these are going to pass. But we can learn something. We can learn something along the way. They help us to understand the mind of God, as Paul stated, that the mind of God, his Godhead, how he thinks, and his plan for humanity, it can be found written even the creation itself. And so this is the lesson that I think, or a lesson that we can learn from the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles. Because God revealed through Peter prophetically that a day is like 1,000 years. And so the Feast of Tabernacles points to a time that is going to be a pinnacle, if you will, of the physical existence. Never will there be so much peace and harmony and prosperity as when Christ returns and establishes his kingdom, or a type of God's kingdom, in Jerusalem at that time. 2 Corinthians 4. So when we examine the creation, we find that, I've done this, watching documentaries and examining, how certain plants grow and the processes of many of the animals, and everything represents God or his plan in some way. And we even see, even in the reptilian world, in venomous plants and snakes and spiders and various reptiles, that these represent something not about God, but about the spiritual world. That there is wickedness out there that is cold and traps and injects poison and is seeking to kill and to bring harm to individuals. It all represents something about God and his plan. And it represents, of course, the fact that the physical creation is fleeting and that it is far inferior to the spirit world. But just because the physical world is temporary doesn't mean that it is of little or no value. And the reason I say this is because I've heard some really downplay the millennium, simply because, it's still going to be a physical existence for most people. And that's true. But the millennium is what these 7 days actually look forward to. The kingdom of God on earth has been an enormous hope of God's people since the beginning of our creation. And the vast majority of prophecies throughout the scriptures actually point to that period of time when Christ returns. And so every tabernacle that God has provided, it serves a purpose, and it should be taken care of. It should be considered to the best of our ability. And so we can use them. We can learn from them valuable lessons of responsibility, of duty, of service, and even the things of God can be seen in his creation. So the world can be enjoyed. Yes, God designed the world for us to enjoy, and he instructed believers to go out and keep the feast and to rejoice during this time. Have a good time. Eat, drink, be merry, enjoy the creation, because it is much like a vacation, isn't it? It's a vacation with classes where we come, and it serves educational purposes and the edification of the saints, but it can be both fun and it can be educational. And though the world is waxing worse and worse as evil grows, and it can be very disheartening to us, we have to consider that life in general is not all bad. The world is filled with a mixture of good and evil. And this was allowed. God allowed this so that we could experience both. What are the purposes of this tabernacle and these tabernacles that we live in? What are the consequences of doing wrong as opposed to choosing to do right? What are the rewards of doing right? What's the point of it all? To what end are we going to serve in this life? Will we serve the self and attempt to build a tabernacle on sand? Or are we going to choose to serve God and to build a tabernacle on rock, even the rock of Jesus Christ? Because we learn from all of these things. We build moral character of what works and what doesn't work as we mature spiritually. And so no matter what we do in this life, no matter what we might try to attain to make us feel more comfortable inside or out, it really makes little difference unless it's in obedience to God. Because what we do in this life is going to perish, except for the character that we build, that we attain and keep with us. These things are going to endure. And so we see that life itself has value. It teaches us that there's another life to come, a life that is going to last forever. And the tabernacle of our body is going to be changed into something that will endure the sands of time. In 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16, no matter how evil the world comes, do not lose heart, brethren. In verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far and more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are not seen, the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. For we know that if our earthly house, that is this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And for this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. And he who has prepared for us this very thing is God, who also has given us the Spirit as a guarantee, or as an earnest, if you will, a down payment, a promise. So we are always confident knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the eternal. And we walk by faith, therefore, not by sight, confident, yes, well pleased, rather, to be absent from the body and to be present with the eternal. And so we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. John 14, and we'll read a final scripture over there. So we are going to be judged by what we do in this tent or tabernacle, whether good or bad. It all counts for something, because this is what is going to be carried over to the next life, the character that we build in this temple for God's Spirit. So the Feast of Tabernacles, it does represent the temporary. It represents going through this decisive process of becoming permanent, hopefully. It is our aim. And it's about understanding that, things in this world are going to fade. But there is value in the processes that we go through along the way, because that all helps us to learn something about God and how we should live. And it therefore points toward seeking the kingdom of God when it comes to this earth. And when everyone at that time will learn about the Feast of Tabernacles and what their hope will become, because everybody is a potential child of God. Not everybody is called to be Christ's bride in the first resurrection, but everyone has the potential eventually to receive a type of life that will be everlasting. Right now, there are limits to what you and I can do physically, and we can't help everybody in this world at this time. And we look out at all of the wickedness going on in this nation and around the world, and we sigh and cry about those things that are taking place. We lived in a country that was once great, and a country that widely respected God, not having an entire understanding of the truth, but still living by the morals that are found in the Scriptures. And we lament over these things, but we see that this is something that the world actually must experience. It's almost like growing pains, if you will, understanding what works and what does not. And all of us, I think, have felt something in some way similar, going through these type of mature, perfecting, growing pains. But so we're in a process of heading toward God's kingdom and attaining a place at Christ's side, but we're not there yet. We haven't been perfected. We all lack some kind of spiritual maturity in some way, I think, and so it's time for us to focus on this, to work on becoming more mature and perfected in this way, so that when Christ returns and he comes back during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the time when I think he will come down and step down on the Mount of Olives, that we will be with him, that we will be like him, that we will be able to help him to rebuild the nations, to heal people, to wipe away the tears, and to see the great rejoicing and the prosperity, and to be a part of all of that at that time, where others will be able to seek spiritual maturity and perfection and be given an opportunity for salvation. And so let us keep this Feast of Tabernacles with the mindset that we are working toward the hope of being like Christ, and having a body that is a more perfect tabernacle that will endure, and having a place in the Jerusalem above. As Christ said in John 14 and verse 2, behold, I'm in Luke. Verse 2, in my Father's house are many mansions or residences, and if it were not so, I would have told you. So I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And so you and I have been given a unique opportunity to be there, to have a place in God's mansion. And today's holy observance is further evidence of the possibility and the opportunity that you and I have to eventually call Jerusalem above our home.